Hey, good morning, everybody. It's 10 o'clock, so I think we will start. Welcome to this ENQA webinar on the use of indicators in higher education. This webinar is part of a series of events and meetings taking place this week in conjunction with ENQA's General Assembly meeting, which was held yesterday. Before we dive into the content, I would just like to remind you of a few practicalities. As most of you have noticed already, there's a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Many people are saying hello already, letting us know where they're from, what the weather is like. So please do make use of that. And during the webinar, please do post your comments and questions. I will pick up on those in the course of the presentations and use them afterwards to pose to the speakers. Please also feel free to post some comments and information about how your agency makes use of indicators so that we can hear experiences not just from the speakers themselves, but also from the participants. I should also say that this webinar will be recorded. And the recording and the presentations will be made available afterwards on the ENQA website. So you will have access to those if you miss anything or you'd like to look at it again, or if your colleagues would like to view the webinar afterwards. The speakers, I would ask you to turn off your microphones when you're not speaking, just so that we don't get any interference with the sound. So now to the content itself. For those who don't already know me, my name is Anna Gova. I'm a senior project manager here at ENQA. I should make a small disclaimer though, and Tia is smiling at this already, but I've been at ENQA since February, and before that I was working for EUA, and I did contribute to the report on which Tia's presentation is based. So I have a particular interest in this subject, and it's been nice for me to dive back into it after a few months away. Of course, we know that data, indicators, and statistics are everywhere, and there's an ongoing pressure to use them for all sorts of processes and decisions in higher education, including for external quality assurance. But nonetheless, the stories behind the indicators are very complex, so it's definitely worth exploring this issue in more detail. And to help us do that, we have a great lineup this morning of 3 speakers. First of all, we have Tia Lokala, who is the Director of Institutional Development at the European University Association, and she will present the key findings from EUA's report on exploring higher education indicators. We then have Stefan Westergaard Andersen, who is the Director of Operations at the Danish Accreditation Institution, and he will present the findings of another report on the use of indicators by Nordic quality assurance agencies, and will complement that with a case example of how his own agency makes use of indicators in their work. And then we're going to hear about the enhancement theme run by QAA Scotland over the past 3 years, entitled Evidence for Enhancement. And this will be presented by Elsa Crum, who is now the Director of Membership Quality Enhancement and Standards at QAA UK. But until just a few weeks ago, she was the Head of Quality and Enhancement at QAA Scotland. So we've invited her today to speak with her old hat on, so to speak, because she's very much an expert in the work that QAA Scotland have been doing over the recent years. After each speaker, we'll have time for a couple of short questions about the presentation. So as I say, do post them in the chat box during the presentations, but then we'll also have time at the end of the webinar for a longer discussion with all speakers. So I'll be collecting questions along the way for that as well. So I think that's all from me, and let's get started. And with that, I hand over the floor, the microphone, the camera to Tia. I would ask the other speakers just to turn theirs off for the moment while we have Tia's presentation. Over to you, Tia.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you for already spelling out the disclaimer, because I did feel a little bit funny preparing the presentation, because I also know that the chair of the session was working on this with us. So this is indeed my input is based on EUA report that we published in May. And it is something that I work together with Anna and Helena Peterbauer, my colleagues at EUA. We started it with when Anna was still working for EUA, and then Helena and I continued in spring, while of course we had nothing else to do then because of COVID-19. That was a joke. We had plenty to do, but we felt that this is indeed an important topic in any case, even if we are in the crisis situation we are in. And the purpose of the report really has been to sustain the conversation or bring some kind of a point of view to the conversation about the indicators. And there are several reasons for that. We've seen in different contexts that we are talking a lot about evidence-based policy making, evidence-based decision making in the institutions or at the higher education system level. And we wanted to see how the indicators have developed, the indicators related to education. And we chose 3 different system level or global mechanisms that presumably at least use indicators related to education. First of all, rankings. EUA has worked on rankings, and we've looked at the rankings indicators over the years or decades already, and we did a mapping of 8 global rankings, what kind of indicators related to education they have. The second thing is we did a survey to quality assurance agencies, what kind of indicators they use. One of the reasons for including quality assurance in this is that we did with Anna a while ago on behalf of the 7 European stakeholder organizations study called EQUIP, or in the context of an EQUIP project. And there we actually talked a lot about indicators, and we had the feeling that quality assurance agencies are using indicators more, or they are at least feel the pressure of using indicators more than previously. And we wanted to see, okay, what kind of indicators do you use? You will see the results soon. Then the third one is funding formula. You may be aware that EUA has been mapping the different funding formula that exist in Europe, and we've done mappings on a couple of occasions. And there we teamed up with our colleagues working on this topic to see what kind of indicators they use. They made a survey to national rectors conferences who reported what is used in their higher education system. So in all honesty, the selection was a little bit opportunist in a sense that these were areas that EUA was anyway working on, and we wanted to see the links between them and whether there are links. And I can already reveal to you that we did find some commonalities here. So I'm not going to go through all the indicators. It would take us a long time, and the presentation would become very complicated. And by the end of this, probably you would be all sleeping, so better not do that. But I took up some examples of indicators used, and using the criteria of quality of the most used indicators by the quality assurance agencies. So first thing to be said about the survey to quality assurance agencies is that the response rate was pretty low. So here I'm doing this for all of you who didn't reply. We would have wanted to have more responses, but there may be good reasons why we didn't have more responses. The survey was, by the way, conducted last autumn. If one of you is now starting to wonder back whether you forgot about it or what happened and when did this happen, when did we miss this? Anyway, we had 24 responses from your group, and 4 agencies said right away that we don't use any indicators. And we're a little bit suspecting that some of those who didn't reply may have had the same response in mind and thought that it's not worth telling us about it. 16 agencies told us what indicators they use. And here are the top indicators. As you can see, out of the 16, they didn't all use all the same indicators. These are now the top 7 indicators used. There are more in the report. As you can see, staff numbers and students numbers dominate. And this is the case also in the funding formula. Well, it's kind of understandable in the funding formula in a sense that you're trying to give money in order for the institution to have enough money to accommodate or offer education for these institutions who receive it. The other thing is the indicators related to student progression, which is the dropout rates or graduation rate. On the other hand, it is the same. It is a way to look at the same thing from a different angle. That's not so used in the other two tools that, or however you want to call the rankings and funding formula, but actually they use then instead the degrees awarded. So that's another way of looking at it a little bit. Student-staff ratio was important to quality assurance agencies, and student satisfaction. It is not quite clear how this becomes an indicator, how you formulate an indicator, but I'll get perhaps back to you. And it would be interesting to know how you make an indicator out of student satisfaction. Admission and enrollment were other indicators that came up in the agencies survey, but not in the other ones. Maybe about the graduation rate. One thing that was missing in the agencies, at least in the top indicator, among the top indicators, is employment rate, which is then used by funding formula and rankings quite typically. In most of them use that one. So what kind of indicators did we then in general find? If we look at the quality of your teaching, were there indicators looking at that? No, they were not. In none of the tools we could find anything that would tell us about the quality of teaching. It may be linked to the fact that there's been a lot of literature research done, which has pointed out to the lack of clear definition of quality of teaching. We don't know what would be the definition for it, so how can we then have an indicator on it? The closest we got were a couple of types of indicators. Is the indicators linked to the profile and achievement of academic staff. Let's say, for instance, how many of them have PhD degrees, how many articles they have published, and so on. But these are related to research task of a professor or any academic staff. They don't really tell you anything about their teaching skills. The second thing that comes across quite often is the student satisfaction and surveys we carry out. But as you all know, as well as I do, there is a lot of research in this regard as well, that these surveys don't really tell you necessarily much about quality of teaching. There's been a lot of evidence that shows there are different biases that come into the picture when the students fill in these surveys, such, for instance, that male teachers tend to get better marks, and race comes into the picture as well. But we can see at the higher education system level a lot of new or maybe continuing initiatives to try to capture the quality of teaching. There are teaching excellence initiatives in quite a few countries, and then, or prizes for good teaching. And then what we see at EUA at the moment, coming especially from the research assessment side, is the initiatives that aim at reviewing academic careers so that they would be reflecting all sorts of academic tasks, not only the research. But these are quite new initiatives, and we will see how they will develop. Most of the indicators in all three, let's call them tools, focused on quality of broader educational environment. I've put the different categories in a circle where you can see that none of them really hits the middle, the core of the issue, which would be closer to the learning and teaching. So the indicators seem to fall into largely 5 categories. As such, it's okay to look at the broader educational environment. EUA has been arguing that we need a good institutional environment in order to have a good teaching. It's not only nowadays, not only about the relationship between the teacher and the student alone. There are a lot of other factors that come into the picture. We all know that, for instance, at the moment, the IT infrastructure is extremely important in order to be able to deliver quality teaching. But it is a bit worrying when you look at the categories that we've got here and how far some of them are from the core teaching and learning task. There are all tools use staff and student numbers. They all had some indicators linked to student progression, dropout rates and such. 2 of them looked at very intensively graduate employment as a sign of quality teaching. There have been studies that talk about the internationalization being part of the quality teaching or quality of education, especially the funding formula and the rankings had indicators related to this, not so much quality assurance agencies. And then there were some, what we called, in one of our reiterations when we were drafting the report, we call them random indicators. Some looked at the diversity and the gender balance. That was a sign of quality. Then you don't know what would be the ideal when you look at the gender distribution. What would you be aiming at? Is it really, really bad if you have more women, or really, really bad if you have more men in some of the programs? SDGs, there are attempts to find indicators around those. So the key findings we came up with is that there really haven't been no major developments in terms of indicators used. What we've said in previous research EUA has done on other topics, and what some researchers said in the late 80s or 90s, still very much stand. We don't have indicators that would really touch the core of the issue. And here I go to the core of the issue. We have no indicators linked to learning outcomes that would be used. In all honesty, we started the whole report writing thinking that we would write a report about indicators on learning and teaching. This may have become clear to you. Had we written a report about that, the report would have been about 2 paragraphs long. 1 paragraph saying there are no indicators linked to learning outcomes and there are no indicators linked to teaching used by these tools. So fortunately, we already mapped the other indicators which you can find in the report. We also found that same types of indicators are used across different tools. So the ones that were on my slide, on a previous slide. What we also found is that there are no universally agreed upon data sets to measure quality. A few years ago, I think 2014 or so, I co-authored with some colleagues a report on rankings. And at that point, we were wondering if we are moving towards that. But when you look at the different tools at the moment and the different definitions they give about what is a student, what is a dropout rate, what is this or what is that, the definitions were still very different. So the devil lies in the details in that sense. And what we also can conclude is that indicators cannot replace more qualitative and descriptive tools as such, but they need to be used in combination with them. So for instance, quality assurance agencies seem to indicate that they don't use, even when they use indicators, they don't use them alone. They, as we all know, we do site visits, we explore beyond the indicator. Indicator was in most cases something that was giving to us as a contextual information to do our site visit and to give a flavor of the institution or the program. And similarly, for instance, in the funding formula, we have the indicators that look back at our how much what we have delivered as institutions, but then usually in almost all cases, this funding formula is complemented by performance agreements or contracts where there is more descriptive and tailor-made goals are defined or explanations are given to an institution. So the formula is not typically used alone. For rankings, this is not the case. They don't necessarily, or they don't use anything else except the rankings and the indicator, and that's it. So in general, it is important to analyze and understand and question what the data stands for. We should not take it for granted. We do that too often to kind of say, okay, oh, we all know what happens when the rankings come out. You know, I am number 45 today, and whereas I was 48 last year, and then we draw conclusions. We should really understand what we're talking about, what is behind the indicators used. The key challenges could be summarized in this way, and this is where I will wrap up and say that it was actually quite depressing to read an EUA report from over 15 years ago, 18 years, actually it was published, I think 18 years ago, which basically gave the same key challenges, formulated differently. Maybe our vocabulary has changed a little bit, but pretty much the same ideas came through. So I'm not going to say anything that surprises anything. One of the key challenges is the proxy problem. We tend to say that, okay, we have these indicators to describe the quality of teaching and learning or quality of education in an institution. But when we look at our indicators, are they really telling that story? To be discussed. Fitness, the second problem, the challenge is fitness for purpose of an indicator. Are we using the right indicators in the right tools? And for instance, here the tools matter. We are fully aware that external quality assurance, funding formula, and rankings, they have very different purposes. You should perhaps think about if you're using the right kind of indicator for the purpose you are trying to achieve with the tool. For instance, funding formula, it is kind of understandable that they use the degrees awarded or staff numbers, student numbers, because that is what tells you the volume and the size of an institution and gives you perhaps some indication of how much money they will need to run their business. Using the same thing for measuring quality, you start to wonder. And there we come to the fact that, for instance, rankings use that. For what purpose? And the final thing is context. It is important to contextualize the indicator, as I said before. We need to go beyond the number to understand what is going on. For instance, the dropout rates and how they are calculated vary from one system to another, and what they mean vary from one system to another, whereas then rankings use, in some cases, this information across the systems. So this is where I will finish and give the floor to Anna.
Thank you, Tia, for that very concise overview of what is turned out to be quite a long report once we took into account also the indicators related to the educational environment. I want to pick up actually on the point you made about there being no indicators for the quality of learning, and also very few about teaching. Is this a problem, do you think, or can we get by without it?
I think we can get by without it to a certain extent. I think one of the reasons why we did the survey or looked at this and is that we wanted to also wake up the universities to think about things, how they measure learning. I think the external quality assurance and funding formula and rankings make it by without having any indicators on learning. But I think at institutional level, we should be thinking of how do we indicate to our external stakeholders or communicate to our external stakeholders how much people learn in our institution. Some of you, and I do notice that there are some people in the audience that have been around for quite a long time. Some of you, at least those people will remember, there was some years ago, OECD, much debated initiative on measuring learning outcomes across the globe. A Halo was the name of it. And in all honesty, we were not very eager about it because it did not contextualize the learning. But I think I wouldn't advocate that external quality assurance needs to find a lot of indicators. But what we should find is that institutions are able to measure learning properly and find indicators that through which they can show whether students learn there. I think one of the positive things about COVID-19 has been that as we've gone online, we've had a lot of talk in the past 6 months about student assessment. And I think that is actually at least something positive coming out of this very, very unfortunate crisis, that we talk about student assessment.
Mm-hmm. I see in the chat a question from Goran about whether you'd come across also qualitative approaches that come closer to measuring learning outcomes, and indeed a Halo is one of those that makes an attempt, and I think there are a couple of other mentioned in the report. I think we'll move on to the next presenter now. So Stefan, if you can put on your camera and microphone. Tia, thank you. We will bring you back at the end to continue the discussion later. Stefan, over to you.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me, and I'm going through loud and clear. It seems to be the case. My name is Stefan Westergaard. I'm from the Danish Accreditation Institution. We were responsible for a study on the Nordic use of indicators, where we surveyed the activities of the different Nordic quality assurance agencies to find out what kind of indicators would they actually use. Is there any use of indicators, and how are they used? It turned out not to be quite as easy as we thought it would be. Tia was hinting at this also in her presentation. We actually had to do this in a two-phase process to get data right, I think we could say. The study was carried out in the Nordic countries, as I said. It was organized so that we would be collecting the data from the different Nordic countries. This was principally from Sweden, Norway, and Denmark and Finland. And then we also had some data on Iceland and the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and the Åland Islands. The latter are not covered by this presentation. The basic reason for doing this study, of course, was that we also saw this interest in discussing the relevance of quantitative indicators when you do quality assurance. And we probably found a bit more, I would say, upbeat and optimistic things also in the study than what was in the previous presentation, but I'll come back to that later. I should also say that this was an analysis that was funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers, so that was also a contribution that helped us, of course, in doing this study. Just very briefly on what I'm going to talk about. First of all, of course, about this study of statistics, the methodology we used, the indicators and statistics that we found were used in the different countries. And then afterwards, I will talk to you about how these data are used in the Danish context. And I'll do that by showing you how we do an accreditation process, an institutional accreditation process that is divided in 2 steps. And then I'll do a brief sum up at the end. Right. I hope that you, Anne, will help me if there is anything in the comments that I have to take care of. I see there's a lot of writing going on there as well. Just about the survey methodology, what we did was that we first sent out a questionnaire and got all the involved agencies to reply to that. And once we got all these answers, we realized we didn't have the right data. We had not been clear about what was an indicator and what was background data. We had not been sufficiently clear about at what level was this data collected. Was this at the institutional level, that you know, the dropout rate for all students at the university? Or was it at the program level that it was done? Was data collected at one stage or at another stage in the process? And therefore, there was a lot of questions that arose from the data that we received. And therefore, we decided to make a second round where we actually made interviews with the different agencies to ask them to help clarifying the use of the different indicators that they provided to us. And of course, that helped a lot. And we got a much more helpful survey once we had these conversations. So one learning experience is that this is complex, and it is for many and good reasons. And as I said, the other point we made was that we have to distinguish between statistics used as indicators or as monitoring tool on the one hand, and then using indicators as mere background variables, you know, like saying how many students are there at the university, how many are enrolled in the different courses, how many professors are there. We would see that as being background information if they're presented just in this very simple way. Right. Then we had a list of indicators, and as you can probably not see on this slide, there was quite a few indicators in the study that were identified. And in a moment, you'll have a more helpful slide, I can promise you. What this slide shows, even if it's very small, is that you can probably see that there are 4 agencies out in the first column. The Danish accreditation institution, the Finnish accreditation institution, the Norwegian one, and the Swedish accreditation institution. They're called slightly different. My apologies for calling them accreditation institutions, but this is the quality assurance agencies. And as you can see, the number of indicators, which is the second column, is quite varying in terms of numbers, as are the background indicators found in the third column. So already here you can see that there is quite a different use of indicators in quality assurance in the 4 Nordic countries. And just to give you one reason why this might be the case, the Finnish organization seems to have a division of labor with the ministry that is using indicators extensively as part of their funding formula, and therefore find that it would be duplicating of efforts if they were also using the same indicators in their quality assurance and have adopted for a much more enhancement-led approach than the one you'd find in for instance, Denmark and Sweden and partially Norway as well. So that's a difference also why there are differences in the use of indicators and background information in the 4 countries as we see it. Right, then I'll just help you a bit with the slides here by going to the next one where you can see a simplified presentation of key indicators. And I'll not go through them in detail, but just give you them very briefly. As you can see, the 2 of the agencies are using student characteristics as an input, mainly as a background variable, but still as an input. In the Swedish case, this also includes the gender balance in the uptake, and in the Norwegian case, you can see that there is a number of different approaches. There is one which is at what level did you? Sorry, that's the wrong way of putting it. I'll just rephrase that. In the Norwegian case, there is on the one hand there is a focus on whether you had the course as your first priority or your second priority or third priority when you were choosing the studies on this list that you can do in Norway and also in Denmark. And secondly, there is also an information about the marks obtained by the students, the average marks, that also gives some kind of background information. And then, of course, there are different issues concerning the environment perceived by the students, how they see their learning environment. And here, as you can see, we use proxies. I will come back to the proxies in some time. But basically, the proxies say, what is the student assessment of their learning environment? This is something Norway is doing. All countries have some assessment of retention rates, that is, what is the success of the institution in keeping the students in their programs. This is done in different ways in the 4 countries. Then there is some assessment of student-teacher contact. This is about how many students are there per teacher in the different courses. And then there is the research environment, which is about assessment of how many articles are written by the professors that are teaching in the different programs. Then there are some activities concerning PhD programs that I'll just skip for now, and then there are some background data about internationalization in the Swedish and Norway case. And finally, then of course, as Tia also mentioned it, some countries also have employability as part of their quality assurance framework. And here quality here is understood as being relevant in terms of employability. And here it's assessed how many students are actually successfully enrolled in the labor market after they've finalized their studies. Right. Now I'll try to take you to just one of these areas, and I'll focus on retention, which you see here as being number 2 in the environment. I'll do that rather briefly because I also have to talk to you about how we in the Danish accreditation institution are working with the indicators. So, talking about retention, as you can see in this slide here, we've just skipped a bit changed the order of the things. So we have the institutions at the top, the Danish, the Norwegian, and the Swedish organization. And then on your right-hand side, you can see 3 different aspects of how to keep people in programs. And the first one is attrition. This is basically about how capable are you of keeping your students enrolled in the first time of having people in the program? What is the dropout rates in over the course of the program? And as you can see, it's actually only the Danish organization that has a measure of the dropout rate. And here it's a simple assessment saying how many percentage of the students are left 1 year, 12 calendar months after they enrolled. So this is something you assess in the second year, once you're in, I think, in the second or third month. Then you see how many students are actually left in the room now after this first year. How successful have we been in keeping them in the class, if you like. Then there are some indicators that are about progression, and progression can be measured in different ways. One is to look at how quick are the students in producing the results they should be producing. This is calculated in Norway, where they look at how many of the, I believe this is the ECTS points, and if not, then I'm sure the Norwegian colleague would correct me on this if necessary. How many credit points are actually obtained by the students during a year. And also in Norway, it's calculated what is the percentage of people who do not succeed in their exams, while in Denmark it's looked at how far are the students in the study as compared with what the time frame for the specific program would expect us to see. And finally, there is the completion rate, which is about how many students do actually complete their studies. And here there are different approaches. One approach is the one chosen in Sweden and Norway, where one looks at what is the share of students that enrolled at the beginning that actually successfully completes their studies. And in addition to that, in the Norwegian and the Danish case, there is also a look at what is the share of students that are actually making their studies, finalizing their studies within the expected time. So you look at, this is a 5-year, this is a 3+2 year trajectory, and how successful are the students in finalizing in time. And here you have 2 different measures. One is how many complete in time, meaning as nominally assumed, and how many complies in the sense that they are completing within the nominal time plus 1 year. So if the study is supposed to be a 2-year study, how many have then completed that study in 3 years? And you heard me before, didn't you? I said 5 years, and that's because many universities would think of this as being a 2-phase model, and they would look at when did the student enroll in our bachelor program, and when did they finalize either their bachelor program or their bachelor and master's program as compared with the the nominal time that was expected to be used for that. So there is a kind of a tendency to look also at this as a whole. Right. Now, then I'll turn to the Danish EQA example to give you an idea about how we use data. This is about institutional accreditation in Denmark, and this is a current case that we are actually doing right now. We had the first visit at this institution back in August, and there was a second visit just completed here in October. And maybe just one thing I have to say to you before I go into this is to say that when we do institutional accreditation, then we have a lot of focus on the capability of the institutions themselves to monitor whether there is quality in their own programs. So just to quote what the report says about this, to be sure that we understand each other in this room, it says that we expect that all relevant actors within the higher education institution are informed about quality issues on a systematic basis. That's point one. That the institution's management is capable of identifying problems at the program level and the campus level, and that management takes proper action. Management here meaning the management of the higher education institution to remedy these problems. So if you're aware of a problem in your program, then you have as management to be sure that you know about this, and you also have to demonstrate that you actually address this problem. So with this background information, I'll just take you through the rest of this. As I said, there are 2 site visits, and the division of labor here is that in the first site visit, the panel will go out and it will, based on the self-assessment report, it will look at the system as it's conceived by the institution. There is an expectation that you have an overall quality assurance system in your higher education institution, and that this system is used systematically in all parts of your university. So it cannot be a patchwork of having different institutes having their own small quality assurance system. It has to be part of an overall system that goes from the program level right to the rector's level. So that's the first visit. This is about understanding what is the system like, how is it working, what is the logic of the reporting in that system, which roles do different actors have in the institution, and what is the institution's own perception of where the challenges are in their work with quality in programs. So once that's happened, the panel folds all the papers, of course, and they sit in the room and they start discussing based on the first visit. What did we learn? Where are we now? What are our key questions to be put to this institution to try to find out if they also in practice are doing what they preach? Can we actually see in the way they work in their organization that they do the things that they intend to do according to the system, according to the papers, according to the different reporting systems that are in place? And that's what's happening in the second visit. So I just have to check my slides. I have to apologize for this, but I simply can't remember how I did this. So this is the first visit. Sorry, I should have taken you here maybe already. This is what I said before, that in the first visit, there is an ongoing monitoring of all programs by the HCIs. That's what we expect. We also expect that there is a holistic assessment of each program and that they do a plan to remedy things that are wrong, to make sure that action is taken. This can take different forms. It can be done by making, first of all, a study on what is the causes or likely causes for the indicators that seem to be showing that there are problems. And then afterwards, it would be expected that they have an action plan that says, how are we going to deal with this problem? And all this has to be done, as we call it, timely. So you can't make studies forever. You have to do studies rather swiftly, and you have to start coming up with decisions about what actions you will take. And finally, of course, there is a lot of focus here on key indicators, but I have to say that, as Tia was saying before, this is not about key indicators, meaning data in quantitative format alone. This is a lot about the combination of using these data as monitoring instruments at the institution, and then adding to that the qualitative data that the responsible people at the institution themselves are able to provide further. And then you say, what the devil does that mean? Well, that means that every institution would make after each year has passed, or every second year, then there would be done a report based on the monitoring of each individual program at the institution, where they would sum up, on the one hand, these quantitative data, and what they would validate whether any of those would seem to indicate there is a problem in the program. And to do so, they would usually be doing either of two things. Either they would be comparing with some national average on this indicator, or they would have conceived themselves a local indicator that they would say would be where they themselves would find that the cutoff point would be if they had to discuss whether we have quality of teaching in this program. So to give you an example, if an institution has said that the ratio of number of researchers, that is people active in research that are teaching, to the number of students in the program cannot be more than 50. That's 50. So every time you have one researcher, you need to have at least, every time you have 50 students, you have to have at least one researcher on average in that program. And you say this is a very crude indicator, and it is. And therefore, of course, it cannot be used alone, and there are other complementary information you would need to have. First of all, you would have to ensure that you have active research in all those areas that are deemed to be key areas in your program. You would have to have an understanding of what is the layout of courses, what is the number of, this is not in particular numbers, but in general, what is the share between having small classes and having auditorium classes, what is the teaching and learning approach in the program, and so on and so forth. And all of that, of course, the program responsible person would explain in that reporting, which is done in the fixed format, that the higher education institution itself would define. And they're not doing it for us. I think that's important to say. They're not doing it for us. They're doing it because this is part of their own internal reporting system that is supposed to catch all the problems that are in their programs. They are themselves supposed to do this. We are not doing this, if you like, anymore. When we look at institution accreditation, we are working on the assumption that we are there to check whether they have in place a system that makes them capable of identifying and rectifying issues in their own quality of programs. Right. Key indicators that we use, I'll just do this very briefly because this is just to give an idea about that there is quite a number of different indicators used here. There is dropout rates, there is the number of hours that are actually lectured to students. We here have information both on classes above and below 40 people in the class. So we have an idea about how many hours are taught in the one and the other setting. We have information about exceeding study time. We talked about this. We have publication points, meaning that there is an expectation that they monitor how many publications in scientific journals would be done by their professors for each program, that is. We're down at the program level. So this would mean for physics, for sociology, for studies in languages, or whatever you would think of. And then there is the share of part-time faculty. This is complementing the question about how many lecturers with research obligations are making lectures to the students, because it's also a way of saying how many other kinds of lectures do the students receive teaching from, apart from the professors who are doing research. Then there is, as I said, the share of students doing the course in nominal time or in nominal time plus one year. And here the assumption is that if a lot of people are going beyond to a large extent, then it must be that there is some kind of misalignment between what is the expectations of the course, the way it's taught, or the contents of the course, or some of the other things that are supposed to be in a learning environment to ensure that students can actually get that knowledge that they're supposed to get within more or less the time that was expected. And then, as you heard, there is also the unemployment rate, because there is a lot of emphasis in the Danish system on having also taught relevant classes. And there's a lot of discussion about this, and I'll not go into this because then I will greatly exceed my time. This will take me to the last slide about the institutional accreditation. As I said, in this second visit, we would be looking at specific programs. And you can say we do use data here in different ways. First of all, we use data to determine which programs to look at. So we have this full view of these different data, and actually we have also the qualitative data, because we request to receive copies of those reports, those annual reports that each program would make, as I said, either annually or biannually. And then we would, based on that, we would look into how's the program performing. And before that, we would actually be using some overall tables that we would already have received with the key indicators, and we would use them to make sure that when we make a sample of programs that we look at, this is a good sample that would help us in discussing with the institution about their qualitative problems of quality in their programs. I'm sorry, I'm doing this a bit brief because I'm getting a bit concerned about the time here, as it's 10:51. But as you can see, it's done in that way, as a kind of a selection of programs. That's what's at the bottom of the slide. We look at size of programs. We look at if there's been any key indicators that would be suggesting that there are problems at the program. And if there are, we would be likely to take them out for scrutiny, not because we want to penalize the institution, but because this is where you can actually see if problems are not only identified, but also later worked on, and if there is an action plan to help the institution in getting this problem solved. And of course, if these things are in place, then of course everything is fine, and you wouldn't ask for any more. I was supposed to talk to you about a little bit about the audit trails that we selected, but I can see that my time is about to run out. So I think I'll stop here for now, and I would be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Stefan. I'm so sorry to cut you off. Want to make sure we have time to cover everything else, and I think we can come back to some of these issues in the discussion at the end. There was just one question I wanted to put to you that was posed in the chat, which asked about the indicators that are used when they're presented by the institutions. Are they presented in the context of what would be good practice related to that indicator? For example, what an acceptable dropout would consider to be in relation to what the actual dropout rate is?
Yes, that would be the way. So a program might say, well, we have an expectation that our dropout rate is no higher than 12% of those students who enrolled in the first year. And if there is any sign that over the last 3 years you've had this indicator that the dropout rate would be above this, you would be expected to make an analysis of what can be the reasons for this and discuss it in the study board, which is the governing structure at the program level, and come up with activities to help rectify this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'd like to bring Elsa in now, and Stefan will come back to you in the discussion at the end.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Elsa, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and good morning, colleagues. Thanks very much for the invitation. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to speak to you this morning. I'm speaking to you from Glasgow, where it is a little bit rainy, but I noticed from the chat that one of our colleagues from one of our partner agencies, ENQA, was saying that it's rainy in Madrid. So I think if it's raining in Madrid, we can let Glasgow off the hook. So thank you. I shall crack on, as we say. So the arrangements that we have in Scotland are, we call them the Quality Enhancement Framework, and we've had them in place for some time, since 2003-04. This is a coherent framework, and the different elements, review, enhancement themes, and so on, are designed deliberately to inform each other. And that's part of the design of the method. Thinking about indicators or reference points, we use a wide variety of these in review, and they come from a range of sources. For example, thinking about background indicators, I think Tia and Stefan both referred to this. UK higher education institutions regularly submit data on background indicators like student numbers, student progression, awards, and so on, through an organisation called the Higher Education Statistics Agency. And these are useful, but they are very much, in our review context, background pieces of information. And in a learning and teaching space, we believe that numbers in any event are only one part of the picture. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk to you about the range of indicators or reference points that we have looked at developing within the enhancement theme part of our overarching framework. So the enhancement themes in Scotland, when they were first launched, they were regarded as particularly distinctive. I think they continue to be distinctive internationally, although they have been emulated. We know that colleagues in South Africa have used this kind of device for working with their institutions, and most recently New Zealand have also adopted an enhancement theme approach for improving practice across or taking a whole sector approach to improving practice within their geographical district. The key element of enhancement themes, I've identified some here, but fundamentally the intention is that by working together, the higher education institutions based in Scotland can achieve more than they would be able to do if they were only working individually. That's the kind of core premise of the enhancement theme activity. So I said we've had the framework in place for 17 years. We've had 17 years of enhancement themes so far, and you can see the kind of range of topics we've covered over that time. I'm going to talk about the enhancement theme that ran between 2017 and the current year. We're just finalising some elements of the evaluation of that theme now, and it was called Evidence for Enhancement, Improving Student Experience. And we have now launched in Scotland our next enhancement theme, which will run to 2023, at which point our framework and enhancement-led approach will be 20 years old. So we're very excited about that. And if I can just add in one shameless plug, we are actually seeking tenders for colleagues or groups of colleagues who might evaluate our whole approach to in conducting enhancement themes. So if you're interested in that, please have a look on the QA Scotland website. So sorry, that's advertorial over. So that next enhancement theme, Resilient Learning Communities, will take us up to that 20-year mark. So looking at the enhancement theme that ran from 2017 to 2020, evidence for enhancement, improving the student experience, we, in determining that we would work collectively with the sector in this area, we posed a number of questions. We wanted to consider what information is useful to help us identify and understand what we do well already and what could be improved, what were the things that could be better. And we wanted to ask whether we use the information we already have in the best way possible. And we also wanted to ask, do we have the right information? We recognised there was no shortage of data, but did we have the data that was really going to help us make the kinds of difference that we wanted to be able to make? So how did we work with the sector? Now, okay, this is quite a full slide. When I'm presenting within PowerPoint, it quite often has animations which can help look at this. But anyway, so I apologise for a very busy slide. If you look at the little central diagram, this identifies that we work with institutions in the sector on 3 different levels. We carry out a series of what we call sector strands, so that's work that is driven, organised by QAA as the lead agency, and should influence practice across all of the institutions in the sector. We also introduced In the turquoise colour to the left of your screen, we introduced a set of activity which we called collaborative clusters, where collections of 2 or more institutions want to work on a particular topic, and ultimately their work in that topic will benefit the whole sector. So those were collaborative clusters with groups of institutions. And down the left of this slide, you can see the kinds of the topics that were covered by these collaborative projects over the 3 years of the theme. We didn't run them all simultaneously. We built them up over the 3 years, but they have all now completed. And then in the third element, or the third level at which we work, institutions individually identify their plan of action that they're going to undertake within their own organisation within the broad scope of the enhancement theme. And down the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a quick synthesis of the kinds of topics that institutions individually were involved in tackling or addressing during the 3-year period of the enhancement theme. Okay, so moving on, as I mentioned, there's absolutely no shortage of data out there, and we recognise that. We conducted a very wide range of work, as you can see in the last scheme, in the last slide, across the duration of the theme. Some of it was engaging quite specifically with numerical data. And for example, we engaged in a programme of work which was aimed at upskilling or helping staff and students to really understand the data that we already have, and to develop their skills in understanding, interpreting and using that data. So we produced guides to using data, one which was aimed particularly at students and another aimed more directly at staff. And we produced some information to help colleagues about the data landscape. So looking at regularly used data sets, what those data sets are telling us and how they can be used within institutional context. So quite a lot of material aimed at development and upskilling. But in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus on 3 particular activities that we engaged in with the sector under the auspices of this enhancement theme. But please believe me, this is just a tip of the iceberg in terms of the amount of work that went on. So the first piece of work that I'm going to talk to you about was looking at the National Student Survey. This is a UK-wide survey, and many of you will be familiar with it, and it's run for some time. Initially, when the survey started, it was voluntary for Scottish institutions to join it, but for the last several years, it's been important, and indeed it's been a requirement for Scottish institutions to join into this survey in order to feed some of the other data sets that are produced and considered across the UK. It's a little bit of an elephant in the room, hence the picture in the image in the slide, in that institutions kind of both love and hate the National Student Survey. We would love it, obviously, when it's like any league table. It's the best league table ever if you're at the top of it. Not quite so good if you're not inhabiting those upper reaches. It's also not only problematic for those kind of reasons, though. It's also an imperfect indication of student learning and teaching success. We know that as a satisfaction survey, it is problematic when you're really truly thinking about learning and teaching. I think it was Tia who mentioned problems with student satisfaction, module evaluation questionnaires. We know that, for example, I think Tia was mentioning that male lecturers tend to be scored more highly than female, and there are all kinds of underlying issues. There's also the undeniable fact that things that students like are not about their experience are not necessarily also those things which genuinely help them to achieve or to succeed. So there are problems with it. Nonetheless, it's a national survey, it exists. We need to engage with it as a sector, and we wanted, as part of the enhancement theme, to look at were there messages for the sector as a whole, not individual institutions, but were the message for the sector as a whole that would be useful for us to really think about in an enhancement space, and were there therefore ways in which we could work with the sector to help ultimately genuinely improve the student learning experience, not simply in an instrumental way to drive up the scores in a particular survey. So this involved having a real deep consideration of what the data coming out of the National Student Survey was telling us about all of the institutions within the sector and also about the sector as a whole. And we uncovered many interesting elements in looking at that, and we worked closely with university planners in doing this, because this isn't a piece of an area of expertise for QA Scotland, but it absolutely is for those university planners who work in institutions. So we gathered a group of colleagues together who helped support this work with us. And one of the very interesting elements to come out of that was looking at those strong correlations within the survey between particular questions and overall student satisfaction. So for example, we found that there is a very strong correlation between students' views about the teaching on their course and their overall satisfaction. So if a student is satisfied with the kinds of teaching they were getting, they are very likely also to indicate they're satisfied overall. Similarly, there's a very strong correlation between students' views of the organisation and management of their course and their overall satisfaction. So those are very strong elements. On the right-hand side of the two graphs there, you can see there is a much weaker correlation between students' views about the assessment they get on the feedback they get on their assessed work and their overall satisfaction. And that's interesting in particular because the feedback and assessment question is one area that is traditionally scored, or that students are much less satisfied with generally than other aspects. So in a sense, that's quite lucky for institutions that there's not a terribly strong correlation between those two elements. And the other element, interestingly, there is quite a weak correlation between students' views of a learning community and their overall satisfaction. And that really is interesting. We wanted to really look at that in depth, because actually in other pieces of work, and one of which I'll come on to talk about shortly, we find that students tell us in a variety of different ways that actually one of the things they really value about higher education and their experience is having a sense of belonging. So it's slightly surprising that there should have been that weak correlation between their views of learning community and overall satisfaction within the National Student Survey. I think that's interesting. And that sense of belonging is something that I think we're all thinking about now, particularly in the current circumstances where we are housebound and talking to each other over these somewhat artificial means. But nonetheless, I'm glad we have these tools, because at least we can talk to each other, even if we can't be in the same room while we're talking. So that was the piece of work on the National Student Survey. Moving on, we also wanted to look at, we also wanted to look at the roles of key members of staff within institutions and how they engaged with data. And one such key role was programme leaders or course directors, or they have different titles in different institutions, but those colleagues who are responsible for looking after a particular subject discipline or programme within an institution. We recognise that those colleagues really are at that pivotal point, and they're often charged with receiving a lot of data about their course, and they're also asked to report on a lot of data about their course within their institution, which is then built up from the various levels within their institution and often finds its way out to external reporting. So we wanted to work with the programme leaders to help them in that challenge with interpreting what can sometimes be apparently contradictory data. So sometimes some of the quantitative indicators around progression and so on might be at odds with the information that programme leaders receive through module feedback, for example, or other sources of information. So we worked with, this was part of one of the collaborative clusters, so it's a group of institutions worked on this a lot, and they wanted to look at the extent to which and the ways in which programme leaders were using that data and recognising, as I said, this pivotal role that those members of staff have there, as the slide says along the bottom, at that critical interface between keystone metrics diverse staff and student voices, and calls for action, whether those calls for action come internally or externally. So we wanted to conduct work to understand that role and to help those programme leaders to navigate the difficulties or the challenges that they face. And we created a range of tools and guides to help those members of staff and to encourage senior colleagues within institutions to think about that programme leader role and to think about the measures or actions they could take to help those members of staff with the challenges that they face. That was that piece of work. Moving on again to the third and final piece I want to talk to you about today, which was referred to in a number of ways as beyond the metrics, charting the intangible aspects of enhancement, or we sometimes just call this the intangibles. And what this piece of work was about, this was another of our collaborative clusters, and what this piece of work was about was creating and defining what are the elements of a higher education experience that we all value, but which are very difficult to measure or are sometimes just difficult to even identify. So what this piece of work wanted to do was identify and map these intangible assets. So this piece of work went through a number of stages. So we were asking, what are the most important intangible assets for us and our stakeholders, and why are these important? So an intangible asset might be, for example, the transformative function of higher education, which you can't get at by looking at student numbers or progression rates, or even the extent to which students get graduate level jobs after they've had that experience. There's something about the personal transformation, which many students identify, many members of staff talk about as one of the most important elements of a higher education experience. But how can you even get close to measuring it, or how can you even articulate it? So that was what this piece of work was about. So step 2 then was about how do we know that we value the intangible asset, and can we map that experience? And then step 3 was saying, now we know what is important and where we invest in it, is it making a difference? If we invest in that intangible asset, will that make a difference? And who for? For the students, for the staff, for a collective. So as part of step 1, we engaged in a wide variety of conversations across the sector, and we had a member of this collaborative cluster from one of the English providers joining with us, because Scotland is quite a small country. We have 19 higher education institutions, including the Open University, and we're very keen to draw on practice elsewhere, whether it's in other parts of the United Kingdom or whether that's much further afield. We're very, very, very keen to reach out and learn from practice wherever it may be. So we ran a series of workshops, and there were 147 participants involved in those in total. And these were the findings about the priority aspects. So I've ranked them here. So sense of belonging that I mentioned earlier, relationships between members of staff and between staff and students, the transformative impact of higher education that I just talked about, well-being of staff and students was highly ranked, and also student engagement and participation. The next stage was mapping these assets in a way so that we could understand them, articulate them, and begin to think about how we could use our knowledge or our articulation of those assets when we are making interventions or engaging in activity to improve the student learning experience within our institutions. And a key part of the work was producing a model which would allow institutions or colleagues within parts of institutions to engage with these intangible assets. There's a report which accompanies this piece of work, which uses the framework that you can see in the slide here, and it has a range of checklists or question prompts that it takes colleagues to be able to use. And the final part was about evidencing against that framework. And this slide here talks about the ways in which, or some of the ways, some of the prompts to individuals who are engaging with this framework, prompts they can use to think about the next steps in terms of evidencing their activity. And the penultimate slide identifies how this framework can be used in a variety of different ways. And I think as both of the presenters so far have mentioned, what we're interested in is less about scoring institutions against particular indicators or reference points. What we're really interested in are, what are the indicators that an institution makes use of? Why did they choose those? And how does the institution's use of those indicators affect the kinds of actions it takes in either evaluating or in seeking to influence the quality of the student learning experience that goes on within the institution? And I'll stop there, but I really look forward to some questions and discussion. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elsa. I would also ask the other presenters to activate their cameras and microphones. While they do so, Elsa, I was interested in the work that that QAA Scotland have been doing actually in supporting institutional staff in better understanding the data they have. It seems like there's a pressure that program leaders are suddenly expected to become also statisticians and mathematicians. And do you see a lack of capacity there? Is that a problem?
Well, I think I'd like to see it as less a lack of capacity and perhaps more challenges being placed on those members of staff. So as the range of data that's available has increased, then we're asking more and more of those programme leaders. At the same time, though, most universities have also invested in colleagues within a central team who are data specialists, and so increasingly we see programme leaders are not actually being asked to crunch numbers themselves or analyse the data themselves, but they are in receipt of that data pre-analysed from the centre of the institution. But you know, programme leaders are typically chosen because of their expertise in a discipline area and because of their skills in learning and teaching and helping to support students. They're not necessarily selected because of their facility with data interpretation. So in that sense, yes, there can be a mismatch between the expectations of what we would like programme leaders to do with data and their facility to actually do that. So yes, I think that was you know, one of the elements we recognised, and we really wanted to put in place some additional support for programme leaders to help them with that challenge.
I see that Tia is nodding there as the representative here on the panel of universities. I wonder if you'd perhaps like to comment about that on the institutional capacity to collect and use data, and whether you see a role for the QA agencies in supporting that work. And I see that Stefan would like to comment on that as well afterwards. Tia first.
Well, actually, when I was listening to the two presentations, I thought about it, that actually we kind of have two cases from Nordic countries, if I may say so. Sometimes Scotland tries to be in that group. And actually, these are systems that are quite good with data. And they do have the capacity. And even at the institutional level, they have data. In most cases. But what we see when we look at the wider Europe, this is not necessarily the case. And the capacity of data management in the institutions is not necessarily there either. So we do see a huge variety in Europe, in the institutional capacity. So in that sense, perhaps what we're discussing right now is not representative. What we see in our work is that the institutions in some systems seem to be doing very ad hoc type of data gathering for each, and doing it manually even in some worst cases. So I do think there is work to be done at the institutional level, but also at system level in some countries. Even if we, as a whole, we see that the amount of data we have on higher education systems and institutions, it has increased all over Europe. Would quality assurance agencies have a role? I think they could have a role in facilitating a valuable discussion about what kind of data is useful. Because I think in both of your cases, you did talk about the fact that you have data, but is it useful data? And I saw that there were comments about it in the chat box as well. That so I think, you know, this kind of qualitative discussion and facilitation, so that not every institution would need to reinvent the wheel completely, while of course they do have their specificities. That could be the role of quality assurance agencies.
Stefan, you wanted to comment.
Yeah, I just to follow up on what Tia is saying, I think there are different things to be said about this. I think one, first of all, is that I picked up from Ailsa's presentation that quality of teaching and learning is best assessed at program level. And I think this is not about data. This is about how do you actually at the program level make an assessment of whether you have a good program. And I think that for any university, I would assume that would be the point of departure when you talk about quality, because there's a lot of this that is qualitative information and not quantitative information. And as I also hope I said, quantitative information here is certainly not used as being a tool in making mechanistic assessment of quality. It's only an indicator. It's a point of departure, something that you have to look into. On the basis of indicator, you have to look into the qualitative aspects that are behind it. And I think that's very important to say. And if I just may make one small comment about this, about the division of labor and the statistics, I think that what's happening in many of the institutions in the Nordic countries is that there is a kind of a central area in the universities that will be distributing these data to the programs, so they wouldn't have themselves to struggle that task, but they will be presented with the data already, so they can use them right away.
Yes.
Tia, I think you wanted to respond.
Yes, if I can just build on that, because there were comments about it earlier in the chat, which I think were absolutely valid, about the disciplinary differences and so on. So what Stefan was saying, that you need to look at the quality of each program on its own and in its own context. This has been one of the reasons why, for instance, from the university perspective, we've sometimes criticized well, sometimes, quite often, we have criticized some of the rankings or other measures which kind of compile everything to institutional level and give one grade or one place for an institution as a whole, because you can have what an indicator means at the institutional level. It can hide so many things inside, because we all know that everything is not perfect in one institution, even if something is.
And that actually brings me quite nicely onto my next point, picking up on some of the comments and questions in the chat about the paradox between indicators needing you need to understand the context behind them. On the other hand, we work in an international environment. We want to know what's going on in different countries, and there isn't necessarily the scope to allow for that level of detail, because if you want to really understand that, you need quite a lot of time to dig into it. Is there a way to solve this paradox? Is it a problem, or do we just have to live with it and try and know that there is a whole lot going on behind each indicator? Stefan.
Well, I think this comes back to trust, really, that you have a trustworthy system, and that people have to trust that the external quality assurance that is done is actually ensuring that there is a certain level of quality in institutions. And that is actually to reduce that complexity. So you don't have to look into indicators for all the different kinds of institutions yourself, but you can actually have trust in the fact that these institutions are doing qualitatively good education. Of course, this does not do anything good for ranking.
I think, yes. I fully agree. It comes to trust, I think I've said this before. It's a question for institutions and agencies also to communicate about what they do, and so to try to increase the trust. But I agree. There's not much we can do about the rankings. I think this is just we have to live with it. It's the way we structure our complicated lives nowadays. We have rankings for everything, so why not also hide higher education institutions. So I mean, there's the ranking for supermarkets and bars and whatever.
Elsa, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I have a fundamental aversion to rankings. I think they suggest that there is some kind of spurious comparability between institutions, and actually I think it's important that we understand and indeed celebrate a diversity of institutions. Students learn and want to achieve and move on to do different things. They need, they learn in very different styles, they need different approaches, and it's really important that our institutions should be able to meet that diverse set of needs. So I think that's incredibly important. One of the challenges when you work in a quality assurance agency is that people who you meet very often, if you're unfortunate enough to ask what it is that you do, they'll very often say, so where is the best place to study X, and insert subject. So where is the best place to study English literature? Now, and the answer to that is not, one particular institution. The answer to that is a series of questions about who is wanting to go there, how do they like to learn, what would they like to do with their degree afterwards, and many other questions besides. So I think I think we should. It's very difficult to fight against rankings, but I think that we should continue to argue against them. There is no one, best way of doing these things, but nonetheless, there are a variety of ways that work well in a variety of contexts. And I think understanding, this isn't about getting away from the question or letting institutions off the hook. It's about adopting a slightly more nuanced approach to those kinds of questions. So I think context is key, and celebrating diversity is incredibly important for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And okay, I'll let Tia comment and then I'll move to the next question.
Well, I basically fully agree with that. That's not it. But I do think we, as I said, I don't think we will get rid of them. They will be there. But I do think institutions and quality assurance agencies, it is also important for us to show that we are also data driven. Because that is what some people who like rankings, because there are in our community people who like them, they do use the fact that, or at least they try to claim that we are about chatting to each other and peers endorsing each other. So I do think that the two examples you two gave are important, and this is what we should be advocating. We should be showing that it's not only the peers telling each other you're doing a great job in external quality assurance. We are using data, and so I think we do need to know how to communicate.
Yeah, sorry if I could come in. I absolutely agree with that, Tia. I think it's also important to emphasise and point to the ways in which we are challenging institutions to make improvements, to enhance what they're doing. So it isn't about patting each other on the back. It isn't about, an easy or softer touch. It is actually really challenging what we're asking them to do.
Mm-hmm. There's a question in the chat from Cathy from the Wallonian agency in Belgium about how to tackle the problem of the existing gaps between institutions' own data and the national or system level data, because she feels that they often differ. Do any of the panelists want to comment on that issue?
I just have to say that this is actually not a problem in Denmark, because there are uniform definitions on this, either found at national level or in the Confederation of Universities, where they also have some statistics. So there isn't this gap in the data, and the data used by institutions would be the data either from the Statistical Bureau, where they are also collected, or from the ministerial different kinds of boards, where these are also published.
What about in Scotland? Sorry.
In Scotland, I recognise a part of the point that I think Cathy is making. That we have as Stefan has just said, we have definitions for different data sets and so on, so there isn't an argument about that. But there can be discrepancies in understanding of data, for example, how we interpret non-continuation, where students might be leaving with an exit award and an institution would regard that as a positive move in a particular student's case if, for example, they were leaving in order to take up a job in a related profession, but they might count as a non-continuing student if they didn't complete the ultimate award that they might have gained. That's just one very small example. There are sometimes wrinkles, if you like, in understanding of data, where we're looking at or making comparisons across slightly different bases. Within Scotland, we look at, because student funding is different across the UK in different places, we can look at data or consider it through different lenses, whether you're looking at home students, all UK students, Europe students, or including overseas students and so on. So there can be challenges, but over time, and as we've upskilled around the use of data in a range of ways, we're finding that there tend to be less discrepancies between more locally held data and that available within institutions as a whole and that within the national system.
We're swiftly coming to time, but I will let Tia also have her word on that matter.
Yeah, I just quickly that, I can recognize all the cases, and I can see that there are also higher education systems where institutions keep maintain different kind of data than what the ministry may be doing. And we've done evaluations in different systems, and we've seen that each university gives us different data. So that the problem exists, but there indeed, how do you reconcile that is probably to have a national dialogue, what makes sense, so that you have at least some data set that is everybody is having in the same format, whereas then in some cases perhaps an institution still prefers, in addition, to have something different that is meaningful for them.
Indeed, thank you. We are now officially over time, so I will have to cut the conversation there and bring this webinar to a close. I think the take-home messages really are that we need to look at indicators in the context in which they're being used. That's not always easy because it's very nice to have little short figures that you think tell you what you want to know, but it's important to concentrate on communication and raising awareness around the stories behind those indicators, and dialogue at institutional, national, and indeed here now at international level is an important way of doing that. So I think all that remains for me to say is thank you very much to our three speakers today, to Elsa, to Stefan, and to Tia. You have made my job incredibly easy by being so informative and ready to give your opinions. Thank you to my colleagues in ENQA who've been helping behind the scenes to keep this webinar running smoothly. And of course, finally, thank you to all the participants who have shared your experiences, posted your comments, and attended today to hear what we have to say. As mentioned at the start, the recording and the presentations and also a list of the resources are available on the ENQA website, so they're there for you to look at in more detail if you wish. And with that, I wish you a good afternoon and indeed a good weekend. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.